Okay, welcome. We have our second lesson under the topic of decision making. In our first lesson, we talked a little bit about definitions associated with decisions. We gave one good example of the government making a choice between military and domestic spending, given the fact that the government supposedly has limited income. And we talked about how making decisions on a personal level is very empowering. It adds a lot of agency to one's life, but the more decisions you make, it comes at a cost, and that cost is responsibility. The more decisions you make, the more you are responsible for your own life. This lesson, we're going to define what logical decision making is, and then we're going to explain various techniques used to make decisions. So it's going to be a little bit of theory, and then a lot of shortcut techniques of different ways to make decisions based on different situations. Not every decision-making technique is good for every situation. And finally, the final lesson answers the question, how much should you repeat a decision? If you decide to get something, should you get more? If you decide to do something, should you do it again? Is more better or worse? Or possibly, it depends, and possibly both. So here is another way to say, to describe decision making. Okay, if you're looking for one unifying way to describe anything, it doesn't exist out there. There's only different ways of looking at things. And are those ways of looking at those things useful, simple, and does it accurately reflect reality to varying degrees? Here's a way of looking at decision making. My claim is that it's a big claim, maybe we should say most, logical decision making is really just this process. Obtain the best information possible of a situation and use that to weigh the costs and benefits of a decision as it applies to you achieving your goals, or as it applies to increasing your satisfaction. We sort of hinted at this in our previous lesson. Once again, so if you're thinking logical decision making, you're thinking about a decision, aren't you just trying to weigh the costs and the benefits to see what's better at achieving your goals? What creates more satisfaction while minimizing the harm? And aren't you always trying to think and obtain the best information possible to accurately make that decision? And so the best decision, the closest technique of decision making that fulfills that definition is your basic positive and negative chart. You could also call it your benefit and cost-benefit chart. If you have a decision to make, whatever your decision may be, you can list all the benefits, all the positives that will come from making that decision. And then you can list all the negatives that could come from making that decision. And then you have to do a lot of mental gymnastics and really come to a conclusion. Should you do the benefits outweigh the costs? And should you make that decision? This is a very, very good technique. It's often used for the biggest decisions that you have to make. For example, what are you going to do next year? If you're a senior, 12th grade going on to the world, what are you going to do next year? Okay? Are you going to get a job? Are you going to travel? Are you going to further your education? And within those decisions, if you are going to further your education, which school are you going to go to? If you're going to get a job, which job are you going to go to? If you're going to travel, how, where, and why, and how are you going to travel? Okay, in order to make those decisions, it's often good to have a positive and negative chart. You can see how this technique is totally useless for very small, inconsequential decisions. You will not create a positive and negative chart if you are going to brush your teeth in the morning. You're probably not going to make a positive and negative chart on whether you should eat grilled cheese for lunch or not. You could, but you probably don't need to. But for the big decisions, there are both positives and negatives of using this technique. Number one, it is good because it really examines your life. It is very thorough and very complete. You will examine a choice very deeply. And to be fair, Socrates, the great philosopher, supposedly said at some point in ancient Athens, the unexamined life is not worth living. There is something to be said for examining your life. Some people believe it adds to a more satisfying life. And how do you know what's really going on with your life if you don't examine it? And one of the best ways to examine it is to examine the choices and decisions you make. Now, This is not to say it is easy. It is incredibly difficult to do this. First off, it is tough to know all the positives and the negatives. You could have all these positives, and if you can't think of one big negative, an unknown negative, boom, that could blow it all out of the water. Or maybe it could be known to everybody but you, and you just might not think of one of the biggest negatives. Well, if you don't think about it, you don't think about it. That's one of the dangers of this. You really got to know all the positives and negatives to the best of your ability. Once you have come up with all the positives and negatives, it's really tough to weigh how much something is positive and how much is something negative. I remember something people always put down on the positives when they're trying to choose colleges. If they're going to choose colleges, they're always like, oh, I really like this college town where I don't like the other college town. Well, you think that's a big thing, but most people end up not actually caring about what town their actual college is in. They weigh whether they like the downtown or the parks so much more than they should be weighing that. And they only realize that later. So you could totally put a big value on something where you really shouldn't. This is also very time consuming. Look how long it's taking just to explain the positives and negatives of the positive and negative technique. It takes a lot of time to examine things this thoroughly. And the last reason it might be difficult is you are actually, when doing this, you are actually arguing with yourself. You're putting yourself on arguing for the positives and arguing for the negatives. So you got to be very careful when you do this that you're just not, a lot of times people have already picked a choice and then they just argue themselves into that choice no matter what the chart might say. So that's a very real danger of this, that you've already decided and then you do what you do best, which is convince your other self. And that might not be the best choice. So be careful that you don't argue yourself into a bad choice. Now, I would argue that all the techniques that come after this in this lesson are just variations on a positive and negative. They are shortcuts. You could do this technique for every single decision that you are going to make, but there are shortcuts that can be used because you probably shouldn't use these all the time. This really is the basis of thoughtful decision making. Now let's take a look at some of the shortcuts. All right, a shortcut is what I am calling follow an expert. The idea here is if you need to make a decision, find someone who is an expert in that field or whom you trust, and then they can tell you what to do and what to decide, and then you can just follow that. And if you find a really good expert, you'll probably be right most of the time because they're an expert and they're right most of the time. It is a very easy shortcut to making a decision. Experts, true experts, have done this work. They've made the mistakes. They've done the research. They know what works. It's their job to know because they're an expert. They have tried and true wisdom. It is very efficient to use this technique. You can spend your time doing other things and you can outsource the decisions to an expert. Now, this is there are some big traps in this. Number one, finding the expert is the hardest part. There are many false experts out there. People who just aren't that good at their job. And so if you trust them, they may be telling you to make a poor decision. And there could be non-experts. So maybe I meant by false experts, people who are actually trying to cheat you. There are people out there who will actually try to cheat you by claiming to be an expert when they aren't. And then the non-experts might be those who just aren't that good at their job, but they are still willing to sort of think that they're good at something and take your money and help you make decisions. There could be conflicts of interest. The expert might not have your best interest at heart. Here's an example. I let someone invest in my very first retirement account, my very first 2 years of retirement account when I got a job teaching. I let someone invest it for me. They were a financial advisor. Well, it turns out they were not legally required to do what is in my best interest. They invested their money in things that made them money. Oh, sure, it still made me some money. The stock market was doing well, but it didn't do as well as it could have because they were selling me things that made them money too. So they had a conflict of interest. They were putting their own interests in front of my own. Now, you can avoid this, by the way. It's called getting a fiduciary. We'll talk about that later, but a financial advisor who's a fiduciary has to do your best interests. They can't do what's good for them. And finally, sometimes the experts are just wrong. The knowledge that the expert has, it might be the best that we know at the time, but it isn't really the correct one. And maybe by doing your own research, you can find a better decision. I think about this as the evolution of the sport of swimming. If you only follow an expert in the sport of swimming over the last 30 years, you would have ignored better ways to swim. We have changed how we teach swimmers over the last 30 years. It's an evolving sport. There was the best that we knew at the time, but if you only blindly followed the swim coaches, you wouldn't even look into other ways of doing things. Finally, I'm going to combine these conflicts of interest and sometimes experts are wrong. Recently, there was a virus, and I'm old enough to remember that the government specifically told people not to wear masks. If you were to only follow an expert, you would not have worn a mask. And that would not have been the right decision for you as an individual. Now, there's two reasons that happened. Number one, there was some ideas that the experts really kind of believed that masks didn't help. Now, I don't know if I believe that, but the experts could have been wrong. But the people who told others not to wear masks from the government came out and said that they did it to protect everybody because people would wear masks incorrectly and it would actually be harmful. And they wanted to save certain masks and not cause a shortage, and they wanted to save it for healthcare workers. So if you just listen to an expert, you might have done what's best for the country or what's best for the majority of people. But if you knew how to wear a mask correctly and you had a mask for yourself, the correct thing to do for your own person would not have been to follow the government expert. It would have been to do your research and wear the mask yourself. You see, there's conflicts of interest, what's best for the country and what's best for the majority of people versus what's exactly best for you at a certain things. So sometimes it's dangerous to follow an expert. Okay, so a shortcut to making decisions is habit. Do what you always do. Go on your instinct. Your instinct is usually just another word for a habit. At some point, you probably thought about it, you made a couple decisions, and then you just started making those choices all the time without even thinking about it, and it's called a habit. Well, this is a great shortcut if you have good habits. If there's something that you have decided is a good decision and you always make that decision, well, that's a good habit. And it's a great shortcut to just be like, oh yeah, I'm always going to do it that way. It's worked in the past. It's the best decision. I thought about it before. Let's do it. Okay. It doesn't lead to an examined life, right? Because if you're always doing things on habit, you're not really thinking about your choices. Okay, well, that might or might not be, depending on how much time you have and whether you want to examine your life, that might or might not be a good thing. Here's a big danger. Few, and I mean very few people have good financial habits. Let me ask you, how many times have you chosen what to put your retirement account in? You probably haven't. How many times have you bought a house? You probably haven't. How many times have you bought a car? Maybe once. That's not enough to have a financial habit. So as we start out, we have almost no financial habits, and even after Americans have made many financial decisions, very few actually have good habits. It's not a good idea to go with habit when you're starting out with your finances. And finally, even those really good habits are wrong sometimes. When I say wrong, they are not the optimal decision. All right, story time. So in 2011, I had a great habit. For multiple years, I had been putting over $6,000 a year away into my retirement account. Exactly what you should be doing just as soon as you can. If you can this year, you should probably be doing it. Everyone says so. The experts say you should be putting away at least that much every single year as soon as you can. Well, I had been doing that for years, at least 5 years, and it was a habit. I would save up money through the year. I wouldn't go out and eat sometimes to make sure I had enough money to put into my retirement account. Nothing would keep me from putting up to $6,000 or more into my retirement account every single year. Well, in comes 2011, and we will skip over all the horrible failures in relationships, and we'll skip over how I had sworn off relationships forever and was trying to come to grips with it. We'll skip right to the point where I had been going out with somebody for over 8 months and had made the decision to ask them to marry me. So we're skipping right over to that. And I realized that I needed an engagement ring. And it needed to be big and sparkly. And I needed to spend a lot of money. Not that it's important to spend a lot of money on an engagement ring. And in fact, people nowadays are spending much less money on an engagement ring. And they're putting that money towards creating a life instead of a huge honking sparkly rock. But I needed a big one because I was 35 years old. This was my last chance. And if she said no, it would be absolutely over and there wouldn't be another chance. So I was going to pour money into that sucker. But the problem was I didn't have the extra money. So how do you buy a diamond ring, a huge diamond ring that sparkles and is really, really, well, first you look for a great sale. You do all your research to get the best ring for your money. But I had to make a decision. I had to ignore the best habit someone could have, putting away for their retirement every single year. For that year, and that actually year and a half, I did not contribute to my retirement account because I funneled the money into a diamond ring to force her to say yes. When they see the diamond that big, they always say yes. Well, I don't know, but she did say yes. And so I broke the best habit one could have because there was a special circumstance. And in the end, it's still a good decision. Let you know in the future, but for right now, still a good decision.